The fifth element, or the fifth basic of writing that we need to really focus in on again, is knowing your audience. This is an element that we touched upon very briefly at the beginning of the semester when we first talked about writing and writing effectively. And it is a basic that gets kind of glossed over sometimes. And so I want to take a couple of minutes and really drive home this idea that knowing your audience is absolutely huge and a much needed aspect of writing that really needs to be focused in on and brought to the forefront because it plays in the background so often, but it is hugely important. As you can see, knowing your audience affects everything about the way that you write. You're not going to write every paper or every paragraph the exact same way. Now, typically, your audience is going to be your professor, but sometimes your audience, though it may be your professor, is assumed to be people familiar enough with the field that you're writing in. For instance, if you're writing a research paper on some sort of literary novel, right? Your professor, say this takes place in your American Lit class. Your professor may not be super familiar with all of the nuances of that particular author, but they are going to know that story. First of all, they're going to know it if they're assigning you to read it and to write about it. But they're going to be familiar enough with that story and with that author and with that kind of writing style that you can use a lot of elevated language to discuss your point. However, if you are writing about if you're taking a psychology class, for instance, and your professor wants you to write some sort of research paper or argumentative paper about some sort of psychological trait or psychological study, and you want to pull something that you've read in, again, your literature class, then you might not be able to use quite the same language when talking about your literary example in your psychology paper that you would in your English paper because you're writing for a different audience. Likewise, let's go into the STEM fields, right? If you're writing a lab report for your freshman biology class, then your measurements and your calculations, you'll be able to use a lot more technical knowledge in that lab report than, say, if you were invited to speak to a class of middle schoolers about why they should care about biology. If you went in as a guest speaker, you wouldn't be able to use quite that same level of technical knowledge unless you really took time to explain it. But then, some of that some of that technical stuff might go over their heads, and so it would just be easier on you and easier on your students to use a little bit simpler terms, right? It's that same kind of idea in writing. Know who your audience is. And again, most of the time, it's going to be your professor. And so you can get away with using that technical language, that hard language, these superfluous writing styles, all these different kinds of ways to have this inflated language, kind of like how I'm speaking right now. Using words like superfluous and inflated, right? Those are bigger words that I would not necessarily use with a class of middle schoolers, but because we're all adults here in this class and we've all gone through high school and we know what these words mean, it's easier for me to get away with using these kinds of words. So know your audience. For instance, again, we talked about if you're writing a lab report, then you might use some of the technical language. Or, um, you might use words, if you're writing for an adult, you might use words like superfluous or inflated, or even something like these kinds of words. But if you're speaking to children, those same words turn into um, bigger language, or maybe extra, to bring, depending on how you want to use that, you could be meaning that in the slang way that has become popular, oh, he's so extra, she's so extra, or you could even take it in its literal sense, because that's what superfluous means, is extra, right? It's over the top. These are phrases that everyone understands, but superfluous and inflated might be something that not even necessarily adults per se, but high school students might know better than middle school students. And then again, experts versus non-experts. If you came in to my office, assuming the COVID crisis wasn't a thing, but if you came into my office and said, Mr. Shook, check out this paper that I wrote on my physics, or rather my chemistry, because I hate chemistry. Personally, if you love it, more power to you, truly. But you might say, Mr. Shook, check out this uh, chemistry paper that I wrote on my lab that I just did. And you're using all of this fancy technical terminology and all of these, you're writing at a super high level because that's just what you know, and you kind of default to it. Then I might look at that and go, that's amazing, that's wonderful. I have no idea what you're saying. Good luck to you. And that's because I am not the intended audience for that paper, right? Your professor is, and your classmates who understand the jargon, and a quick jargon, your classmates who understand the jargon would know that paper better and understand what you're saying. Now, I use the word jargon. What does jargon mean? Well, jargon is a particular style of writing and speaking. They are these particular terminologies that people use when they are in a specific environment. Um, one of the one of the instances that comes to mind in a hospital, if you are visiting a friend or a family member in the hospital and you hear somebody busting through the emergency room yelling code red, or you hear them yelling code blue, what are they saying? Well, if they're saying code red, it means that there's a medical emergency and that people need to get out of the way, clear the area so that people can get through to the emergency room. If they're yelling code blue, it means that whoever is on that gurney is dying. But if you bring a 12-year-old into the hospital and they just hear code blue, they might not know what that means. They might not understand the gravity of the situation that's going on. And that's because they're not familiar with the jargon. That is a particular set of, or a particular way of speaking, style of speaking, that not everyone is necessarily going to know. So that is one thing that's hugely important when writing, is to know your audience. Know if you are writing to an expert in the field or if you're writing to, say, the general public. If you look at popular speeches, speeches like the Gettysburg Address or any kind of public speech that a government official gives, they tend to not use very inflated or superfluous language, right? It tends to be very down to earth or simplified language. Now, it might be heated language or very passionate language, but they tend to not use these big Ivy League 4-year college kinds of words and illustrations because these people in government offices have to be able to speak down to the level of everybody in a country, right? Everyone needs to be able to understand the president or a Senate leader or some sort of congressman or some sort of congresswoman, and these government officials need to be able to speak in such a way that everyone, whether a person has, again, a PhD or a person who barely scraped by with a GED, can understand and make it through and better know what is going on and to understand what that person is saying. So knowing your audience is absolutely huge in writing. Again, when you write for this class, then you're writing all of your papers thus far, and your papers that you have for the rest of the semester will be written to me, being your audience. So you can get away with superfluous or inflated language because you know that you're writing to somebody who is on a slightly higher level than, and I don't say that to puff myself up, but I'm saying as opposed to, again, a 12-year-old, right? I would hope that I'm smarter than a 12-year-old. You should hope that I'm smarter than a 12-year-old. And so you can use language with me as your reader that might be more technical than, say, a 12 or 13-year-old could understand. But knowing your audience is absolutely hugely important. Um, one example that I wanted to bring up for the children versus adults is think of books. Think of children's books versus adult books. Are any of you familiar with the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table? Well, if you watched a lot of Disney movies growing up, you might have seen a cartoon movie called The Sword in the Stone. Now, that is a children's movie that tells the story of King Arthur as a boy and how he ascends to his kingship. Depending on the high school that you went to, or just for fun, if you're into King Arthur stories, you might have read a book called The Once and Future King. Now, The Once and Future King is a series of 4 books that detail the life of King Arthur, and the first of these books is The Sword and the Stone. However, the author of The Once and Future King, T.H. White, wrote with a little bit more elevated language and writing style than what you see in the Disney movie that's full of cartoon characters and your typical Disney appeal for young children, but that's because T.H. White was writing to a slightly older audience. Now, The Once and Future King is still overall classified as a children's book, but or maybe a young adult book. It's good for high school reading, right? Your 13, 14, 15-year-olds. Sword in the Stone is good for your 9, 10, 11-year-olds, right? But that's because T.H. White knew his audience and Disney knew their audience. And so in our next video, we're going to talk a little bit more we're going to continue our discussion on arguments, but I really wanted to drive home this idea of knowing your audience.